Hi, everybody. I think in the interest of time, we should get started now. My name is Rena Tucker. I'm the Executive Director of RHEDI, and that stands for Reproductive Health, Education, and Family Medicine. And I'd also like to introduce Ian.
Hi, I'm Ian Legue. I'm the Curriculum Manager for RHEDI. And if you have any technical issues, feel free to raise your hand and chat with me directly, and I can address any problems you might be having with the webinar. Thanks.
So we'd really like to warmly welcome everyone to this RJ 101 webinar. This is the first webinar we're doing, so please bear with us if there's any technical issues that come up. For those of you who aren't familiar with RHEDI, we are working to strengthen and expand reproductive health education, especially abortion training, into family medicine, and we are doing that by providing grant funding, technical assistance, curricular resources, and evaluation research to support the integration of this training into family medicine residency programs across the country. We are also committed to integrating a reproductive justice approach into reproductive healthcare training and services, and are very excited to have Monica Ray-Simpson from SisterSong provide background and perspective on ways to do this. Before I introduce Monica, I'd like you to know that given the limited amount of time that we have, Monica may not be able to get to all your questions, so please do send them to us via the evaluation form that we're going to send out after the webinar, probably tomorrow, and we will plan to post a recording of the webinar and SisterSong's answers to these questions on a later date. So now I have the honor of introducing Monica Ray-Simpson, who is the Executive Director of SisterSong, a woman of color Reproductive Justice Collective. A native of rural North Carolina, Monica organizes against human rights violations, the prison industrial complex, and structural racism through a feminist interdisciplinary approach to Black liberation from a Southern to a global scale. A true Renaissance leader, she is also committed to birth justice as a certified doula and centers the reproductive rights of Black women as part of her practice. Monica's masterful integration of activism and artivism created a path for the release of her first live album entitled Revolutionary Love, an album praised for its blending of her gospel roots and her passion for social justice. This innovative sound is what she calls revolutionary soul. As a performer who works to empower marginalized people and tear down broken systems, Monica was named as a new civil rights leader by Essence magazine and chosen as one of the Advocate magazine's 40 under 40 leaders. All right, Monica, it's all you.
So good morning, everybody. It really is an honor to be able to be with you all today and to have an opportunity to have this training with you all on reproductive justice. Today, we're going to be talking about achieving health equity and justice through the reproductive justice framework. And this training is really set up to be a beginner's kind of understanding of what this framework is, who we are as a movement, and how we talk about this work. And hopefully you all will be able to understand what it means to implement these particular pieces of theory into your work and to take that theory into your practice, right? So I'm going to move right along and get all the way into this. And we start all of our trainings at SisterSong with this question, or really this statement, I should say. You know, we all have a story to tell. And so we can't do this work of reproductive justice without talking about our personal stories, what brings us to the work, what keeps us in the work, what drives us in this work. And so many of us have personal stories around that. And some of us are holding stories of our loved ones and experiences that we've shared with people that we care about that really root us in this work every single day. And so, you know, I think this is what makes this movement and this frame so transformative, because it is always centered our experiences. It's always centered. Before we even step into this conversation today, I just want to take a moment, just a moment of silence for us just to remember our stories, those stories that we all have that connect us to each other and that bring us closer to this work. So let's just take a moment and think about that. Yeah. Sometimes you can see the whole story. Sometimes it's just like data points along a journey, but they're all there. They're all there with us. And the more that we remember them, the more that we center them, the more that we can deeply connect with the people that we work for and that we serve. So I want you all to remember that, as you are providing services, as you're connecting with people in this work. We never know anyone's story until we ask, and we should hold all stories as sacred. So SisterSong, really excited to be partnering with you all on this webinar today. But, we are the National Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective, and we are a national membership organization founded in 1997. We were founded by 4 different mini communities. It was Indigenous women, Black African American women, Latinas, Asian Pacific Islander women, and they pulled themselves together, their resources, their cultures, realizing that they were more stronger collectively than individually. And our purpose is to build an effective network of individuals and organizations to improve institutional policies and systems that impact the lives of marginalized communities. And SisterSong's mission is to strengthen and amplify the collective voices of Indigenous women and women of color to achieve reproductive justice by eradicating reproductive oppression and securing human rights. So as of last year, 2017, we've been doing this work for 20 years, and we count that such a blessing, to be able to do this work and to see how far reproductive justice as a movement and framework has really come. And it's brought us to you all, right? To us doing this webinar with you today. So when doing this work, before we even jump into the definition of reproductive justice, before we get into what does it mean to implement this frame into your work, and before you understand like who we are as a movement, it's impossible for us to do all of that and not acknowledge, our history, to not acknowledge, that history that so many of the folks that we do this work with, that so many marginalized communities have to, hold in this world as they do their work, as they live, as they go for services every single day, right? I think that's important for us when thinking about our service providing partners, that, our work isn't done in a vacuum. It's not done in a silo, that we have to remember that, colonization is real and it has a long history that really makes it hard for communities to trust a lot of times. It still brings up a lot of pain and trauma. So when we think about things like colonization and slavery, and, all of these different things that you all will see as we kind of go through this, as we talk about reproductive oppression, we can't have these conversations about reproductive justice without centering ourselves in that history and realizing that reproductive oppression didn't just start. It's something that our communities, especially the most marginalized communities, have had to hold and fight through and resist for decades. And so when we think about how colonization, slavery, definitely impacted Native and Indigenous people, Black people, African people, being brought to this country, and their labor and their bodies being exploited. We think about how, in terms of the medical industrial complex, how different experiments and things were done on bodies of Black and brown folks, like the Puerto Rican birth control pill trials. And we think about the sterilization of Black women, and the Tuskegee experiment, right? We can go throughout history and see, and unfortunately, see so many different instances where, again, the bodies and the spirits and the, of Black and brown folks have just been violated. And then we can even talk about the ways in which that has also showed up across, all marginalized communities. When we think about LGBTQ discrimination and how the fight for LGBTQ folks to be seen, to be heard, and their concerns about their bodies, their communities being centered, has also been a struggle and a fight, right, that we're constantly, unfortunately, still in. And so when we ground ourselves in that historical context, again, when we take ourselves through our longer trainings, we're able to really ground ourselves in that historical context, because to do this work without doing that actually doesn't allow ourselves to be able to see the fullness and the wholeness of the individuals that we're looking to serve. So the concept of reproductive justice, actually, a lot of people think that it's something that's relatively new, and it's actually not. The concept and the naming of reproductive justice came about in 1994. A long history in organizing around human rights work in this country. And after a really pivotal meeting in 1994, which was known as the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo, Egypt, there were conversations being had at the international level around this coming together of reproductive health and rights work and social justice, right? And so there were women who were able to be at that meeting in Cairo, and these group of Black women came back to the United States, and they started to ask themselves, what would it look like for us to do that level of organizing here in the United States? What would it look like for us to really look at our reproductive health and rights in connection to the very real social justice issues that impact our communities every single day? And they were thinking about this right at the height of the of healthcare reform under the Clinton administration. And so that they thought to themselves, and their organizing moved them in a way that really helped them to say, and to craft this reproductive justice frame of, if we are going to talk about healthcare reform in this country, we need to center the most marginalized. We have to listen to Black women. We have to make sure that, you know, all of who we are is included in this conversation, and very specifically that in this conversation of healthcare reform, that we are not excluding conversations around abortion and abortion access, right? And so with all of that organizing together, they actually launched the term reproductive justice. And there were a group of women, which you'll see a little bit later, and that we like to name because we are very intentional about making sure that we name and honor the shoulders that we stand upon. And these are the names of those folks. And you'll see that Loretta Ross, who was the first national coordinator for SisterSong, was in this room, along with, you know, a room full of folks from many different points along social justice work, from elected officials were in the room. There were faith leaders in the room, people who were doing LGBTQ work in the room. So it's a very diverse group of Black women that came together to really bring this term into existence. And their first action was to basically call out Congress, right? And to tell them, again, if you're going to talk about healthcare reform in this country, that you are going to center the most marginalized, listen to Black women, and not exclude our reproductive health care when thinking about the larger, more broad term of healthcare in this country. And so they did this action in 1994, where they put this call to action to Congress in the Washington Post, demanding that they listen to them. And this was signed on by over 800 people all across the country, standing in solidarity, right, with their action, which again, for us is very much, you know, what we see as like the launch and the birth of the reproductive justice frame and movement. So when we think about reproductive justice, we know that the terms reproductive health and reproductive rights have been terms that have, you know, have long-standing histories, have very well thought out strategies as well, and they've been doing a lot of amazing work. And so sometimes, you know, folks try to say that, oh, is reproductive justice just like a synonym to reproductive health and rights? And it's not, right? All three of these movements, right, have very intentional histories, have very intentional strategies, and are doing really amazing work, right? And so when we think about reproductive health and rights, they're what they were really rooted in and continue to be rooted in is like this more choice framework, right? It's like, you know, pro-choice was the word, it was the frame, it was the language. However, though, when thinking about pro-choice as a strategy and as a frame for folks to really organize around, it was a little bit alienating for some marginalized communities when we think about, you know, how power and privilege and class and so many things show up, you know, as individuals doing this work. And as organizations doing this work, right? But there was a need to kind of expand beyond just the choice framework that seemed a bit limited, right, in its approach. And so reproductive justice expanded that by really incorporating more of a human rights frame and really looking at movement building, cultural strategies as a way to really move, again, marginalized communities, folks of color, closer to these issues and centering their leadership and their expertise in doing that. So when we think about reproductive health, we think about those who are doing the service providing, right? Those are the entities that are, making sure that we have access to abortions, we have access to our reproductive health services. And then reproductive rights, of course, looking at like the legal advocacy side of things as well, right? And we can talk about different organizations that show up in those particular sectors or those particular movements. And reproductive justice builds on that, right? It's a movement that is led by people of color. It's a movement that is, again, rooted in human rights and was able to bring in a more intersectional approach to actually do this work, right? So how do we define reproductive justice? And I think that before I move forward in the definition of reproductive justice, it's important for me to say that I think what also makes reproductive justice so transformative is that it's not only a framework, right? It's a framework that helps people organize and move their work in a different way. It is also a movement. So to be able to be a movement led by communities of color, folks of color, and indigenous folks, and to have that movement also have a frame by which other movements can actually implement makes it really powerful, right? So I just wanted to make that point. But to define reproductive justice, we say that SisterSong defines this as every individual has the human right to decide if and when they will have a child and the option or the conditions, under which they will give birth. 2, every individual has the human right to decide if they will not have a child and their options for preventing or ending a pregnancy. 3rd, every individual has the human right to parent the children they already have with the necessary social supports and safe environments and healthy communities, and without fear of violence from individuals or the government. And lastly, every individual has the human right to bodily autonomy, free from all forms of reproductive oppression. So when we think about, saying this with a little bit more, just a little more simply, right? We say that everybody has the human right to decide if to have a child, to not have a child, to parent the children they already have in healthy and safe environments, and the human right to bodily autonomy. And when we think about bodily autonomy, this is where we get to be a lot more expansive when thinking about how do we incorporate, our the LGBTQ community. How do we talk about sexual freedom? How do we talk about, the ways that we talk about sex or not in our communities? Like, it gives us a more broad sense of being able to talk about the fullness of our lives. And so that's what we define it as, right? So if we were in a room together, I'd give you all a pop quiz, but it's kind of hard to do that on a webinar. But hey, we'll still might find a way to do it. We might find a way. And our vision for the work is when all people have the economic, social, and political power to make healthy decisions about our bodies, for ourselves and our communities in all areas of our lives, right? So this work of reproductive justice is making sure that we are thinking not just about the here and now, but we're thinking about the future. And how do we make sure that we have all that we need in terms of, again, that social, economic, and political power to be able to make the decisions that we want for ourselves, and that we're able to then move in a more proactive way to ensure that our communities are living and thriving in the best of ways. So when we think about like implementing a reproductive justice framework, right? So we talked about, that definition of the being able to have the human right to have a child, to not have a child, parent, and, bodily autonomy. And we think about, our vision for being really more all-encompassing and making sure we have all of the different, the socio-economic, political power to make those decisions and to do that so our communities can survive and thrive. Then we have to think about then when implementing this framework, what does that look like if you're not in a reproductive justice organization, right? But you feel that this more intersectional approach is one that can help you do that. So when thinking about the implementation of the work, we think about how do we center the most marginalized communities, right? How do we understand and implement intersectionality? How do we work to achieve human rights? And how are we working to dismantle structural racism within our work? Right? So these are the 4 components when thinking about the implementation of reproductive justice framework into your work. These are the 4 things that we have to hold center, right? Centering the most marginalized, understanding and implementing intersectionality, working to achieve human rights, and working to dismantle structural racism. So how do we define reproductive oppression, right? Reproductive oppression is the control and exploitation of women, girls, and gender oppressed people through our body, sexuality, labor, and reproduction, right? And we can spend a whole day talking about the way in which our bodies are controlled and exploited, right? From the media, from policies, from within our own communities, unfortunately, economically, environmentally. Like, there's so many ways in which we can just talk about reproductive oppression. And so this is at the again, one of those pieces of work when we think about what is reproductive justice looking to do. We're looking to eradicate this, right? How do we identify what reproductive oppression is so we can actually eradicate that? The other thing that's important to know, again, when thinking about the implementation of the framework, is understanding the human rights frame, right? So I wish I could see you all's faces, but there's so many folks who don't even know, when I'm in rooms and when our trainers are in rooms, helping people understand this reproductive justice frame and how to implement it. And we get to this question of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So many folks don't even know that this exists. So many folks don't even know that there is a universal document, not saying that it's perfect either, but there is a universal, because everything can be debated at this point, but it is one that gives us more of a solid ground to stand on, a more common ground to stand on globally even, right? That says that you as human being, that you have the human right to do these things, right? You have your civil rights, your social rights, your economic rights. All of these rights are inherently yours because you are a human being on this planet, right? And that should not be taken away from anybody. No one should have that taken away from them or stripped away from them or legislated away from them, that these are all of our inherent human rights, right? And so when we think about why, whenever these, Black women in particular came together to name, reproductive justice, why were they so committed to this human rights frame? And it's because when we think about, one, it gives us more of a global understanding, right? That's absolutely at the core of it. But it's also, when we think about, the U.S. Constitution, right? And that is our, document of this land. However, when we think about when the Constitution was put into place, who did it really think about, right? Who was it really created for? And it wasn't created, for marginalized communities. It wasn't created, for Black folks. We weren't even seen as human. It wasn't created for women. It was created for land-owning white men, right? And so we're still working from a very flawed document. And we've had to do so many things over the years to make this more holistic, to make this more just, right? This document and this law abiding work that we all have to kind of be connected to. But again, at its core, right, it wasn't really thinking about marginalized communities, right? So these are just things we have to name and own and understand in our history of this country, but also how that history impacts the way that, we do our work, and it impacts the lives of the very people that we're serving as well. The other thing that we mentioned in that little bubble of implementation of the RJ framework was intersectionality, right? Being able to understand what that means and what that is, right? And so intersectionality is a term named by Kimberly Crenshaw, a Black civil rights advocate and lawyer and scholar, right? I'm so grateful for the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. She's still doing amazing work. If you don't know her, you should totally follow her. But although the intersectionality as a practice and as an analysis is one that has been bubbling for decades, right? She actually helped to name and really put some frame and context to what intersectionality was. And it is a framework designed to explore the dynamics between coexisting identities such as Black and woman, and connected systems of oppression like patriarchy and white supremacy. And it's integrative, meaning that it talks about the fact that multiple oppressions can exist at the same time, and actually usually do, and they overlap and connect and bump into and smash into sometimes each other. And it's expanded over the years to include age, ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, immigration status, religion, and national origin. And one of the things that really makes it so powerful, not that any of this other stuff isn't amazing, but it challenges single issue organizing. And that is another thing around reproductive justice that makes this such a transformative framework, right? I feel like a lot of social justice work is very siloed in a lot of ways. It's you do criminal justice work here, you do environmental justice work here, but reproductive justice is we can't do criminal justice without thinking about environmental justice, without thinking about reproductive health and rights, without thinking about, all of these things are connected, right? And I feel like I live by this quote of Audre Lorde that says, you know, we can't have a single issue movement because we don't live single issue lives, right? And so this is what that I feel like that's like the best way to explain intersectionality, right? And why it was important to really root the reproductive justice frame in this particular analysis. What's also important to know about intersectionality is that it's not an identity itself, right? It's not something you can put onto a thing and say that you've done it, right? That's not how it works. Intersectionality considers social inequality beyond that which is part of the individual experience. It requires a thorough consideration of power and how it operates as a dynamic on both the individual and the collective basis, and it's mindful of context and conscious of how comparative privilege can shape and even limit perspective. Intersectionality is a process, right? It is a process, and it's something that we have to actually be engaged in. Again, not to just put on top of our work, but how are we actually digging into our power dynamics? How are we looking at how it shows up within our organizations? How does it show up externally, right? Intersectionality requires work to be done by the individual and or institution or organization who's really looking to explore and like move towards it, right? It does take it, you have to be actively working intersectionality for it to actually work, right? So I want to take a moment to kind of to talk about a particular piece of work that we at SisterSong engaged in that helps us understand reproductive oppression, right? We just talked about what that meant. It helps us understand intersectionality, right? These overlapping layers of oppression. It helps us understand like the violation of human rights, right? So again, not to move this from theory, right? Because all of that is beautiful, amazing theory, but what does it look like to move that theory, right, to actual practice? And that's what reproductive justice does. It's created this theory by which the framework is developed, but then we take that theory and we move it into our organizing, right? So this is one example of how it looks to move that theory into practice. And I want to bring in the story of Marissa Alexander. I'm not sure how many folks are familiar with her, but she is a Black woman, Black mother from Jacksonville, Florida. She was in an abusive relationship. It was documented. She had went to the police on numerous occasions because of her violent partner. So after she had just given birth to her child, her violent partner came back into her home again, trying to violate her. And so this time, I feel like she took on the energy of Fannie Lou Hamer, who just celebrated a birthday. I think it was last week. But she says, you know, I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. So she went to her car, got her gun that was legally registered to her, came back in her home and shot it in the air to scare him away. She hurt no one. She was able to just move this violent person out of her home to protect herself and her family. But the way that our criminal justice system is set up, who do you think went to jail, right? It wasn't the abusive partner. It was actually Marissa, right? And so how do we break this theory? How do we break this down from looking at what does it mean to take a reproductive justice approach to this and to move from theory to practice? So one, Marissa's human right to parent her children in a healthy and safe environment was violated due to domestic violence. That's one of the key components of reproductive justice, being able to parent our children in healthy and safe environments. And this was violated due to domestic violence. Her human right to to be able to live a self-determined life and to bodily autonomy was violated due to domestic violence. And due to an unjust criminal justice system that lacks the ability to analyze and eliminate racial and gender bias within legislation such as the Stand Your Ground law, right? Because what got wrapped up in her story, she tried to use the Stand Your Ground law in Florida because she was literally trying to protect herself. It didn't work for her, but it did work for Zimmerman, who murdered Trayvon Martin, right? So we can, again, these overlapping layers of oppression, again, right? We can see how those come into play. And then because of her imprisonment, Marissa was alienated from her children, which included her then 9-week-old breastfed daughter. So can you imagine what it means to like have to pull your child away from nursing at that stage in their life and what that does to the child as well as the mother? And because of her imprisonment, Marissa's children were placed in the custody of the man who was charged with the violent behavior. So again, just seeing how unjust the system is, and how, what it means, what reproductive oppression really looks like in people's lives, right? So again, when we think about the different issue areas in the lives of those folks that we're looking to serve, or within the communities where our businesses or organizations or whatever, where we are, right? This is what people are living with every single day. And they're coming into our organizations, they're coming into our places of business, they're coming to get services, and they're coming in with these stories. They're coming in with these stories that are being, they're so real to their lives, but also that is just a reflection of like the larger inequalities and just unjust systems, right, that are at play every single day in everyone's life, right? So again, when we think about this implementation of the RJ framework, it goes back to the stories. It centers our human rights. It helps us to understand intersectionality. And we have to be actively working to dismantle the system of white supremacy, which is actually the very thing that is holding on or is making it impossible for folks to be able to live their best lives, really. So we see, with this, with the implementation of RJ and what does it mean to like really move from theory to practice, it's not just about looking at organizing opportunities like we were able to organize around Marissa Alexander and actually get her free in partnership with the Free Marissa Now campaign. And we led an action in Jacksonville, a march through Jacksonville, and we stayed on, those folks there until she was absolutely free. And now she is, in our movement. She works with us. She is speaking on behalf of these issues in this work. And that is just an example of what it means to actually be on the other side, right, of oppression and injustice. And not to say that she's not having to still deal with things in this world because she's a Black woman in the United States of America, but for her to now be able to step into that work from a position of a leader, right, as a voice, is a powerful thing to see, right? And we also see other powerful displays of people really taking, seeking justice, right? And so when we see the removal of like J. Marion Sims' statue, he's been called and coined the father of gynecology, but we also know that his practices were just inhumane, and the way that he was butchering and violating, slave women's bodies, in the name of science. And for us to then laud him as, a hero was just absolutely insane. And so organizers were able to get that statue taken down, right? So we're not praising these symbols of folks that we know have actually violated and committed some of the worst acts of reproductive oppression in this country. And then we also see, folks like, us honoring the life of Henrietta Lacks in a different way. And the movie that just came out a couple of years ago now, that Oprah Winfrey did around the life of Henrietta Lacks. Again, people starting to understand this history, right? And wanting to write this history, but also wanting to make sure that it's known, right? Like what has been, what people have endured and how people are organizing and moving beyond that. And then we also have to think about the ways in which, those folks who are in, doing this medical work and becoming service providers, whether nurses or doctors or practitioners or whatever kind of work they're doing. But, we have to think about what they're being taught, right? And so not too long ago, we see in one of the nursing textbooks how the Pearson company had to issue an apology for publishing racist theories about treating pain in a nursing textbook, right? So it was literally in a textbook that Black people, Black women in particular, could take more pain, right? And this is something that is in a textbook that's being taught to someone who's now going to go out into the world and treat people, right? So this writing of history needs to be understood, but also this rewriting, right, of how people are educated and what messages that they're taking away, from their schools or from their curriculum. It's also really critical and key to this, which is why this implementation of the reproductive justice frame is so critical, to those who are in the medical industrial complex and doing service provision work, right? Is because what the curriculum gives you isn't going to match what's real in the lives of the folks who are coming into your facility and coming in for care, right? And just, I know that many of you know this, but, especially with this recent Supreme Court, decision, to move, it still breaks my heart to say that it's happening, right? But we have a new Supreme Court justice who has said publicly, who has said many, many times, that they're not down for this whole work around abortion care and access that we do in this country. And so it's a very scary time to think about what's at stake. And we already know that we are living in a world where abortion access is already limited, right? And so to think about what does it mean to have elected officials and people in place that have already said that they're not here for it, what that then is going to mean in terms of our organizing and what is going to mean for the people that we serve. It's hard times, right? And there's so much that we have to get ready to fight. Not that we've already not been in the fight, but so much more that's coming down the pipe. And so this bridge that needs to happen between those of us who are doing the advocacy level work, the grassroots organizing work, and those who are service providers, doctors, all of that, that we can no longer work in silos away from each other, right? This is the time for a reproductive justice approach to be taken, all the way through, right? This movement needs to grow by leaps and bounds by those who are service providers, because we're going to need the knowledge of our service providers, just like our service providers are going to need the knowledge of those of us who are doing, again, this grassroots organizing culture shift work at the same time. And so I think that this webinar is right on time. I think it's so critical and so important for those of you who are, again, doing this service provision work to be able to start to bridge that gap and to understand what reproductive justice is and how you can really bring that through the work that you're doing and how you're servicing folks. So another thing that, when thinking about how we use this work from theory to practice, and what does it mean to look like to move a reproductive justice frame through a campaign, right? So I'm not sure how many of you know about the LARC Statement of Principles that we did in partnership with the National Women's Health Network. But, LARCs are a big thing, right? They are a part of our reproductive lives. And we want to make sure that everyone has access to what they need to be able to make whatever decisions that they want, right? So this isn't about saying that LARCs are bad. This is about saying that if we see an over promotion of a particular method over another, that we have to be mindful of that history that we started this conversation out with. And we have to be mindful about, how are we making sure that we're not being coercive, right? And how are we making sure that we're not putting our own, bias or our own value set on someone else, right? Because one of the things I've heard in some of the trainings that we've done is that, well, we know, but it's the best method. And we don't want unintended pregnancies to continue to rise, or we don't want people to, have to deal with another method that we know may not work for them. And then they'll have to that's actually not our decision, right? It is our role as, those of us who understand this work or who are actually providing the services to give people the information and help them make the best decision for themselves in a non-coercive way, right? So that's just one of it's a hard thing to do when you have to pull ourselves back, to allow people to make their own decisions. But this is where the human rights frame comes into play, that everybody has that human right to make their own decision for themselves. Right? And everyone has the human right to step to that decision, to ask their questions, right? But it's not our job to make that decision for anyone. And so we did this statement of principles that helped service providers understand how to do that, right? How do you have these conversations? What do you need to take into consideration? And so this statement of principles was signed off on by over 100 different service providers, across the country, and it's still used as a really powerful tool for folks today. The other piece of work that we brought into play a couple of years ago that, again, helped us move our theory towards practice in terms of maternal health was us illuminating this issue of the rising rates of maternal mortality in this country and how Black women in the South were dying at a rate 4 times higher than white women in childbirth. And in some metropolitan cities like New York, the rates were even more astonishing. It's like 12-1, right? And so what we wanted to do with this work, again, was to take a reproductive justice approach, which was like, how do we center the most marginalized folks' experiences? How do we go to them to ask them, you know, but is it, then how do we then amplify this in a way that helps people understand, you know, how to address this issue and to talk about it in their communities. And so we held focus groups in 2 states, Mississippi and Georgia, which were where we were seeing the highest rates of maternal mortality. SisterSong did, to ask folks on the ground, what's happening? Why are we seeing maternal mortality go up? And throughout all of the stories, what we were able to really come to a consensus on, unfortunately, is that we can't think that we don't need to talk about the ways in which racism shows up in this country in every other area, from police brutality to other criminal justice issues, and not think it doesn't show up in the medical industrial complex, because it does. And so these Black women that we were interviewing and bringing into conversations were telling us it didn't matter how much money they made, it didn't matter what their education background was, that was because they were a Black woman walking into doctor's offices, they were automatically treated stereotype that for some reason people didn't think they and nobody was asking them, are you in pain? How do you feel? Do you need something else? Those were not the questions that they got, right? And it's astonishing to us, you know, work that I've done in a time, you know, at the grad, so open, and that with folks' stories, centering, if we're not trying to
Hi, everyone. I think maybe there's an issue with Monica's internet, so we're just going to pause for just a moment while we get that sorted out.
Great. Am I back? Can you hear me?
We can hear you. Yes. If you want to share your screen again, we can pick up where we left off.
Yay! Absolutely. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure how that got knocked off, but I am right back here with you.
Terrific.
I apologize, y'all. Amazing. Please forgive my technical difficulty. But yeah, that was just another example with this to illuminate this. I'm now muted. Am I muted? Now y'all can hear me, yes?
We can hear you.
Ian?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay, something flashed on my screen. Beautiful. But yeah, that's it's another example, right, of how to take this theory of intersectionality of human rights to practice. And so we created this report that you see here, Racial and Gender Discrimination in the U.S. Healthcare System. You all can actually find this online very easily. In this report, we were able to take it to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the UN in Geneva to frame this as a human rights violation in this country. And because of this work, and because of us being able to really amplify this in the ways that we did in partnership with the Center for Reproductive Rights, we were able to really start to make moves around this. And so now we see, like, Senator Kamala Harris just put forth a federal resolution on maternal, health care in this country, right? So again, this is, by using this reproductive justice frame, we've been able to see how we have shifted culture, shifted conversations, and actually won, right, in so many different ways. Another piece of our work, I'm actually here in North Carolina today. We have a state-based office in North Carolina, and a piece of the work that we're doing here in this state in particular is around the ending of shackling of pregnant women in childbirth. And we were able to get this information about women being shackled during childbirth from our service providing partners who were putting their reproductive justice hats on, right? And thinking about their work from a different perspective. And so they're like, we can't address in our way, but we know that you can. And so again, when we see these worlds like connected to each other, then we're able to like get information that we would never have access to because we're not service providers, right? But our providing, organizing friends, we're able to get that information to us so we could actually move campaigns and start to move the conversation on the ground. And now we have this entire campaign here in North Carolina about the ending the practice of shackling across the state, right? And so we got a small administrative change, earlier this year, which we see as one very small step towards victory. But this is such a human rights violation, right? Like your human right should not end because you are, caught up in this, prison industrial complex, right? And so you should be able to give birth with dignity and not to have your hands drained while you were in labor trying to give birth, right? So again, this is another way to talk about these intersecting oppressions and what does it mean to then use a reproductive justice frame to address them. So there's a couple of questions here, and I want to leave some time on the end here. I'm trying to give us about 10 minutes here on the end, see if there's any questions. But there were two questions in particular that came up before the webinar that I just put here as some placeholders to kind of engage in some conversation with you all. And one of them is about suggestions that we can, I can't read it because this little thing is in the way. What suggestions can you offer about how to apply the reproductive justice frame in a day-to-day clinical practice? And how should an understanding of reproductive oppression and coercion change the way primary care physicians in particular approach their patients? So what we're hoping, again, I know that this was a very, we weren't able to go into the full training with you all, but just to give you some definitions and understanding and a little bit of grounding on what reproductive oppression is and what coercion has looked like, throughout history, that should always be, that should always be centered in your work. And I know that might seem heavy, right? To have to hold this history, but people have to walk with this history every single day too. Right? They are the descendants of that oppression. And so if we're all just being mindful about the history, so if we're mindful about it, then we're less likely to recreate it, right? And I also think it's important in the day-to-day practice, and I say this in a lot of the different sessions that we've been able to have with service providers, I know that it seems like there's just so little time to have with our patients and the folks who are coming in for services. We have to find a way to change that, right? And I think this is where we can start to do some radical work with each other on how can we start to get people's stories and understand who they are better when they're in these offices with us, right? Is there a way that we can add more of a storytelling feature to our intake process? Can we start to think about how do we use past patients or patients who have, indicated that they want to start to organize or move closer to our issues? How do we empower them to step into leadership and become, ambassadors for us and coming in and volunteering and helping people feel more comfortable? How do we start to make people feel like we see them when they come in, right? That they're not just their name on a piece of paper and they're not just their appointment time, right? That they are an individual that comes in with a story, with very real issues and needs. How do we do that? That is what reproductive justice is calling us to do. Right? It's calling us to understand oppression. It's calling us to understand that the most marginalized communities are dealing with so many layers of oppression every single day. It's calling for us to understand that this larger system of white supremacy in this country it's suffocating, right? And so if we're not able to understand all of those things, right? And hold them in our practice and in our work, then we're not taking a reproductive justice approach. We're just doing the status quo. And so what we're asking is to like take a more RJ approach to that, and like find those ways, and to be creative within your within your service spaces, right, to do that level of work. And this other question around what advice I would have or offer medical educators training new residents to improve their interactions with patients is, it's obvious that the curriculum that you're working from isn't up to date. Right. And I think that there's a lot of work that's being done at the academic level, with folks really trying to insert, new theories and new ways to talk about this work. But it's so outdated. That's one of the things I've been getting from a lot of, medical students and like folks who are in the medical industrial complex. They're just like, we're working on very outdated things. And I think that by adding in current events, by adding in political education, right, to training courses for new residents, that's a way to help people ground themselves in the very real realities that they're going to be serving in. Right? Because it feels like to me, again, I've never went to medical school, right? But it feels like to me that these classes are not setting people up for the real world. They're setting them up to deal with, paperwork. They're setting them up to understand how to chart, how to make sure that people are, things are calculated correctly, but it's not teaching you about the real world, right? Because people are coming in with the real world experiences, also needing, access to a LARC, or also needing, abortion access, or also, what I'm saying? Like, they're not just coming in with that one thing. So I think that that's the main thing, is like, how do we incorporate more political education into our trainings? I think that would be so effective, and it's so necessary to help people understand, again, the real lives that people are living, and how they can better serve them by understanding the realness of the world that we live in. Like, we don't shut off the world just because you're stepping in the doctor's office, right? That doesn't happen. This other thing, I want to make sure I got any other questions. Oh, and then how do we help residents not perpetuate patterns of reproductive oppression and coercion, right? In this example of like, presumes a pregnant 16-year-old girl, a person on Medicaid must be subjected to a discussion about abortion and or post-abortion contraception. I tell people all the time, to say yes to a job of service means that you must first do, and you must actively be working on yourself constantly, right? I can't, call myself a person working for the people if I'm not checking my own biases, if I'm not checking my own experiences in life that may make me see things a particular kind of way. It requires a certain level of personal work to do service work, right? And if folks are not committed to that, then I'm really concerned about an individual being in positions of power within service, right? That is a very scary thing. We've seen this with police officers. We've seen this with judges. We're now seeing, we've seen this with some doctors, right? And we have to start calling those things out. If and I think it's imperative, for those folks who are called to service work to do their personal work. It's absolutely imperative. I think that those who are doing service work should be going through anti-racism trainings. I think that those doing service work, should, just have like a regular check-in with the therapist themselves. Like, it requires a certain level of work, right? And I have no other words to say other than it requires that personal work. And to, again, understand that a 16-year-old that's coming in, that's pregnant, do we even know her story or their story? Do we know why? Do we know what that's connected to? Maybe there is no shame. Maybe, there's so many things that come into play when thinking about a 16-year-old that may get pregnant, right? Was there violence? Did this person have access to comprehensive sex education? Probably not if they're living in the South. Probably not if they're living in most places in the United States of America, right? Was there, so there's so much. It goes back to those stories. It goes back to understanding the fullness of individuals and not just taking a sliver of their life and thinking that you know the fullness of who they are. That's impossible, right? And if your job is to serve, it is not to judge, right? So I'll stop there because I want to see if we can get any other questions. And I know I'm hitting right at 2 minutes. So Ian, Rena, y'all let me know where we are. But, you know, these are just some resources for some continued education, y'all. If you haven't seen any of these books, you should get them. You should read them for sure. They are really, really great. Undivided Rights, Reproductive Justice, and Radical Reproductive Justice both have writings of Loretta Ross in them. Killing the Black Body by Dorothy Roberts and Medical Apartheid. All amazing, amazing books. And, you know, that's our beautiful house here in the West End, and my board and staff. Yay to them. They're an amazing team of folks that work with me every day. But yeah, we want to stay connected to you all. It's really important for us to bridge this gap and to be more in partnership with each other. So I'll stop. Thank y'all so much. It was so fast.
Thank you, Monica. Really, really appreciated that insightful webinar, and you provided us with a lot of background and information that we can all use to inform our work and our education of residents and patient care. So we'll look forward to future opportunities to bring your voice back and to share with others. For those of you who didn't hear at the beginning, this webinar will be recorded. And as we're pretty much out of time for additional questions, please do submit them to us via the evaluation that's going to be going out, and we're going to compile them and have the folks at SisterSong and Monica share responses, which we'll post at a later date. So, and we love everyone's feedback on future webinars for us, whether it's on RJ and other topics. So thank you all so much and have a great day. Thank you, Monica.
Thank y'all so much. I appreciate you. Have a great one.
You too. Take care.
Bye.